free and appropriate public education. What the heck does that mean? And how do you determine it? If you want to know more, stay tuned. Okay, free and appropriate public education is also known as FAPE, F-A-P-E, in special ed lingo. And every child that qualifies for an IEP is supposed to have a free and appropriate public education. But how do you determine that? I mean, you might think that Johnny needs every resource that the school system has. How do you know what they need and they don't need? Where do you even start? Well, it all starts with an IEP meeting. Actually, it all starts with evaluating your child first. The school system needs to evaluate your child in all areas of suspected disabilities. So if you already have an IEP, every 3 years, they have to do an evaluation on your child again. So you can request then, or even sooner than 3 years, that specific areas be tested. Or if you're wanting to obtain an IEP, they have to do an initial evaluation in order to determine if your child qualifies, and they also need to test them in all areas of suspected disability. Okay, great, they test them. Now what? Okay, you're probably going to end up with a bunch of tests that have standard scores and all sorts of different scoring things that you don't understand. And you will want to consult with someone who does understand. You will want to ask the school to explain to you, and you'll want to do some Google research to understand. Once you can see if the test is done with a standard score or a median score or whatnot, you can determine if your child is falling in the average range, the above average range, or below average. Okay, and so you'll want to learn all of that, and I will try to do a video on that. It's kind of complicated, not my expertise. I know how to do it, but we'll see. Anyways, stay tuned because there might be one. So you end up with all of this information about your kid. Okay, you're like, great. What do I do with? How does this relate to what my child needs? Okay, so you then are supposed to have an IEP meeting, whether it's an eligibility meeting for the first time getting an IEP, or an eligibility meeting at every 3 years to see if your child still qualifies, or even if it's just your yearly IEP meeting. You're supposed to have an IEP meeting. And in that IEP meeting, all of the professionals that work with your child and any areas that seem to be of concern should involve a professional also, whether they work with your child or not. All of those people should be giving input on that IEP in something called the present levels of performance. And the present levels of performance is also known as the PLAAP, P-F-L-A-A-P, present levels of academic performance or something like that. And it's usually at the beginning of the IEP. It's definitely before any goals or anything like that in the IEP. And the present levels will go through different levels. They'll go through the academics. They'll go through social communication. They'll go through writing. They'll go through all sorts of areas. And each of the individuals that either works with your child or could work with your child and has evaluated them in some way weighs in on that document. Now, before you ever walk into that meeting, any of those meetings, you need to ask for anything they plan to discuss ahead of time. I say 5 days ahead. You need to ask for it because you need time to go through those test scores, to Google what the heck does this mean on the Wechsler test. You need to be able to do that. And then you need to be able to see what they're saying about your child and see if it matches the test scores and see if every area is identified on the IEP. And what that is called is a draft IEP. So you need to ask for a draft IEP and anything else, including evaluations that they plan to discuss at the meeting, and I say 5 days ahead. Okay? I have actually used that information, created graphs to show regression, and taken graphs into a meeting. I mean, I've spent a whole day preparing for IEP meetings before. And I've taken color-coded graphs into a meeting and said, here you go. You want to tell me how that shows that my child's doing so well? Kind of hard when you've prepared. You don't have to go to that extent, okay? This is a mom that has been doing this a long time, and I haven't had to do that in a while. But you need to review all of that information. And in that draft, it should have what the professionals believe as far as strengths and weaknesses, okay? Now, what do you do with that? Well, you look at it and you say, okay, they're telling me my child is reading 2 grade levels below average. We obviously need some reading help. They're telling me that my child's math scores are off the charts. Okay, we don't really need to address math in the IEP. But my kid can't write a paragraph and they're in 7th grade. Okay, we need to work with writing. And it could be an occupational therapy thing where the kid can't get the thoughts from here to their hand. It could be an expressive language thing, which would fall under speech. It could be they just don't understand. They need some additional help. There's lots of areas that something like that could fall into. So what happens is you go through and you read those present levels and you go through each category and you find out where the weaknesses are that they've identified. And those are what you target for goals on the IEP. And those goals are what is supposed to provide FAPE to your child. Now, another component of FAPE is how much help they get, because you might identify that they need reading help and you write a goal that they're going to have reading help, and hopefully it's more specific than that. But what does that mean? How much help are they going to get? Is it just whenever the teacher decides? Or is it on a set schedule? And who's going to provide it? What kind of help is going to be given? And how are you going to know the progress on that? All of those things are a piece of FAPE as well. And all of those things need to be defined in the IEP. I hope that that makes sense for you. I want to give you a story to illustrate how FAPE can vary. I'll just say it like that. So, long story short, in a school system, have a kid that's struggling socially. In fact, that's the biggest thing that shows up in their present levels is their social struggles, that they don't understand, they can't read social situations, they get upset and sad with their peers, they don't know how to respond. All of that was the biggest thing that came up in this IEP. Okay, we had other things like we got to work on some reading and whatever, but over and over and over it was social. So this happened to be my child. So we sat down with the IEP team and I said, okay, we need to work on this. And we had several meetings to talk about this. Well, in our school system, for the type of social skills that my daughter was requiring, which were reading social cues and learning how to respond in social situations, my school system had decided that only a school psychologist can provide that help. Now, I know that's not true because I have another child that's been given the same help, and she's been given it for years by a speech therapist. But in that moment, in that IEP, I was told that only a school psychologist can provide it. Great, let a school psychologist provide it, whatever. Well, the problem was, in my school system, they had also decided that if you worked in any way with a school psychologist, that you had to sign a form that you were consenting to counseling services. We didn't want counseling services. Counseling services weren't being offered. And we didn't want them. We have a private counselor. And no, I'm not going to sign your consent for counseling services because they're not in the IEP. We don't want them. We have a private provider. You're not even proposing them. We went round and round. They had their attorney there. We had our attorney there. They had the special ed director there. We went round and round. Special ed director and their attorney both agreed the counseling form does not apply to the services your child would receive. We will try to amend it because you need to be able to sign a form that's more relevant to what your child is receiving. Great. I don't think I need to sign another form at all. If I give consent on the IEP for services, that's enough. But sure, let me see another form. As long as I'm not consenting to something that you're not proposing and I don't want, then I'll consider it. Well, we went round and round, and every time I would hear, just give us a little more time, just give us a little more time. And so we finalized the IEP with the psychologist and the specific goals that I mentioned, which were reading social cues, learning how to respond, that kind of thing. Well, if you've not seen my video about invisible decision makers, this is a great example of that. Because I'm sitting in these meetings with the special ed director and the district's in-house attorney, who are both telling me you shouldn't have to sign this form, but we have a policy, we just have to get you a new form. They would say, just give us a little more time. They would come back and say, you have to sign the form. Who do you think is telling them I have to sign the form? It's an invisible decision maker. And at one point, the in-house attorney, and we have this documented in our meeting notes, at one point, the in-house attorney admitted that because the psychologist at the school was an intern, that his university professor was requiring that form. I've got a university professor that doesn't know my kid, isn't even involved with the school system, deciding what services my kid can have, and that I have to sign a form for services I'm not even wanting? Really? If that's not an invisible decision maker, I don't know who is. And I have to wonder if they were pacifying the professor because they were getting the intern for free. So we had an IEP that said psychologist, all the goals I mentioned, that was signed. Everybody signed it. And these administrators could not get me another form to sign. And it came down to the rubber meets the road of, you have an IEP in place for these services, but you have to sign this form in order to have those services. And I said, I'm not going to do it. I gave my consent for the services on the IEP, and that's it. Guess what they did? Suddenly, my child's needs changed. Her offer of FAPE changed. It changed because of their internal issues. Only the psychologist can provide. And you must sign this form. And suddenly the greatest need that my child had didn't exist anymore. Now, they were willing to allow the speech therapist to work with my child on initiating with peers. But even themselves, in the meeting notes we had, already said she knows how to initiate with peers. She just doesn't know what to do once she's done that, which brings us to a higher level goal. So they went in and said, we're changing her IEP, and you're welcome to come to the meeting, but we're changing it. And so our attorney and myself, we sat down, we came up with 6 proposals of how they could not change the IEP, ways that they could get around, working around the stupid form so that they didn't have to change the offer of FAPE. And it didn't matter. They declined all of them. And in the written notice they gave us, which is another video I need to do, prior written notice, they have to outline why they made a decision and all the evidence to support it. They actually admit that our child needs what was originally offered, but because of the form, they can't provide it. That's how FAPE can be changed. And they changed it. And ironically, they changed it to exactly what they wanted. I don't believe they even considered any of the things that we proposed. They changed it to exactly what the special ed director was proposing to our attorney 2 days after the meeting that the IEP was signed, because they were in a pickle. They had a legally enforceable IEP that they needed to implement, and they couldn't do that because I wouldn't sign their extra form. So they changed FAPE. Now, I could get into you about the whole discussion of, am I going to dispute that? Am I going to use the dispute resolution options? I don't know who watches these videos. I have told them that a state complaint is coming. And when that hits will be up to me. I will carefully time that. But I can tell you that FAPE should be determined on your child's needs. In this case, it was not. So you need to watch out for only this person can do this, or we just simply don't do that, because it's supposed to be a free and appropriate public education that is individualized for your child. Individualized. And as we were sitting in some of the meetings and I would say, well, okay, the psychologist issue is obviously a problem. Can we have the speech therapist do it? They would say, oh, the speech therapist is only here 2 days a week. She doesn't have enough time to do that and her speech sessions. Really? We're going to base FAPE on someone's schedule? Isn't it supposed to be based on my child? And I called them out on that. And when they suggested the first time changing FAPE because they couldn't get the psychologist issue resolved, I told them, the offer of FAPE doesn't change because of your internal problems. But it didn't matter. They ended up in the next meeting changing it. And ironically, as I said, they changed it to a goal of that she would initiate with peers, which I mentioned we already know she knows how to do. And the district documented that she knows how to do that in one of the meeting minutes from one of our mini meetings. Well, a month after they changed FAPE and made it just so that she worked on an initiation goal, we got a progress report in the mail. Guess what? She's mastered initiating with her peers. Imagine that. Shocking. I had no idea she had that skill set, even though we all knew it. It's documented in the meeting minutes. But again, FAPE wasn't about my daughter. It was about them looking clean on paper and internal policies that affected the decisions of what my daughter would have for FAPE. So FAPE is a really critical thing. One other thing I want to tell you about that, when we were trying to discuss how much time should be given to my daughter for, the social help, and it had been identified as the greatest need in her whole IEP. It was the greatest need. I prepared for one of the meetings and I figured out that the amount of time they were offering for her to have help with that, because they wouldn't let teachers help or anything. It had to be the psychologist, and it was only for so many minutes a week. I figured out that it worked out to be less than 1% of the time she was at school. And so I actually started a meeting by saying, I just need to tell you this. I need to lay this out for you. I said, greatest need, we've identified it, everybody agrees. And yet she's here for this many hours. This is how much time you're offering. And that works out to less than 1% of the time that she is at school. Does that sound like FAPE to you? And there was silence. So make sure you understand what they're offering and make sure you're prepared when you go into a meeting, because something like that, even my attorney was like, wow, something like that is pretty critical. And if you just say, oh, they'll get 30 minutes a week and that's great, until you can show it in relation to the big picture of how much time they're at school or how they need it more across the board throughout their week, not just that 30 minutes, it can be a pretty powerful tool when determining FAPE. So I'm sorry for the length of this video. I wanted you to hear that story because that is a great example of FAPE being based upon their needs and not my child. And so if you're not subscribed, I hope that you will. I hope you'll watch my other videos. And, I just contact me. My email is below if you have any questions. But I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to have you as a subscriber. And until next time, make it a great day. Thanks. Bye.